So it's the big election in America between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. While there is so much interest in India and around the world as to who will become the next president of the United States, it ultimately boils down to a bunch of swing states, some important communities, whether they show up at the vote or not. We'll also talk about the Indian American community, whether they are overwhelmingly Democrat or they split. Let's try and find a little bit more about this U.S. election, which is being closely watched, with Dhruva Jaishankar, Executive Director with ORF America. Thank you very much, Dhruv, for speaking with us. So, big picture, I mean, we're a day away from Election Day. Just how big is this election? What are the stakes?
It's a big election. It feels like every 4 years there's a big election in the U.S. It's a very divided polity. Roughly 45% of Americans vote Republican, 45% vote Democrat. And really, it's only about 5 to 10% whose opinion has to be swayed each election. And the divides are quite deep across age lines, gender lines, cultural lines, rural, urban. I think there's a big divide there. So I think this is playing out again, as it is every 4 years.
What do you think it'll boil down to? I mean, in such a close race, is it the swing states? Is it who's motivated more? Is it anti-incumbency? What's the big X factor?
There are lots of X factors, which is what's making it hard to predict. The polls show pretty much a 50-50 split. 7 states will really determine this election. They're called the swing states. I find it hard to believe the winner will not be the winner of Pennsylvania. I think that would be a state that just mathematically, unless many other results go in a very unexpected manner, that's a state that both either candidate will have to win the election.
That's the biggest.
That's the biggest prize.
Swing state.
Yeah. And the margins are going to be very thin. So ultimately, it'll come down to voter enthusiasm for the two candidates. Whether more of Trump supporters come out to vote on Election Day, or whether more of Harris's voters come out. And that will happen tomorrow, and that will really determine the outcome.
So, one interesting thing, and I guess in elections past, other than the 2021, one new phenomenon we're seeing is a lot of people are voting early,
yes,
either by post or by mail-in, by in-person early voting. I think 75 million is the figure that I last checked. That's almost half the electorate.
Yes.
Is there anything in there for us to know that's perhaps the way in which this election is going?
So that has really changed a large part because of COVID. The last election happened during the pandemic, and that led to a lot more early voting. Traditionally, early voting has favored Democrats, and so those are counted later. That suggests that in many states we'll see a blue wave, a Democratic swing later. But it really will depend on a number of other factors. One of the things that's happened this time is this signs that more Republicans are voting early.
Voting early. Okay.
So the balance may not be as skewed towards Democrats as in the past. But again, we'll only know after counting is completed.
Let's talk a little bit about the Indian American community. There's about 2.5 million of them. Generally they've been sort of Democrat leaning. This time, are you seeing anything different?
So traditionally about 2/3 are registered Democrats, about 25% are registered Republicans. There is some indication, there was a recent survey done by the Carnegie Endowment, there's another one of Asian American voters. It suggests that the picture might be a bit more complicated, particularly amongst younger men who might be gravitating more towards the Republican Party. But on balance, I would expect that the majority will still vote Democrat.
Tell us a little bit more about the younger men, because it's not just the Indian American young men. We're seeing that amongst African American young men. We're seeing among Hispanic young men, of course, white young men.
Yes.
Why are they gravitating towards Trump?
There are many sociological reasons. There's actually a very good book on this, on the sort of frustrations of younger men, particularly in developed economies, including the U.S., that they see fewer opportunities in the job market. They see they think that a sort of liberal agenda that prioritizes certain constituencies, including women, has been to their net disadvantage. And Trump and others seem to channel some of those frustrations. So they see an appeal there, and they see the doors closing on them more within the Democratic Party.
There's also the other side, which is women, at least in this cycle, seem to be very motivated for Harris because of the abortion issue or any.
Yes. So just for people who don't follow it, this has been a very divisive issue. The Supreme Court in the U.S. overruled Roe v. Wade, which was a landmark legislation that gave essentially reproductive rights to women. And I think the fear among some women is that if Trump is elected, he will put on the courts, including the Supreme Court potentially, more conservative candidates, so that this will become more difficult in the years to come. Whereas, again, a Democratic president, because they get to appoint justices will put in place more liberal-minded.
I want to come back to the Indian American community. One big issue has always been about visas, immigration, H-1B, etc. And I think from the Trump years, people remember that he was very sort of strident on H-1B. Do you see that changing if Trump were to come back to power again?
Absolutely. No, I think there'll be a few. Immigration is a big issue he has campaigned on. Both he at different times and his advisors at different times have had different messages around immigration. Some say he's only focused on illegal immigration, that he doesn't have a problem with legal, particularly high-skilled, which are often very Indians. And again, some of his advisors have emphasized that. But I think there's another issue, which is he plans on actually cutting funding for a lot of immigration processing.
Okay.
And that will, there will be people, and this will happen, I think, to Indians, which is that people who are coming here as students, as business people, as on work visas, and they may find that just the bureaucracy is.
So it'll take longer.
It'll take much longer. Okay. And this happened in between 2017 and 2020. And in fact, what the Biden administration was trying to do is reduce those backlogs. But even now, the wait times that if you go to a consulate or an embassy in India, the wait times are very long. So I think that's not, again, directed at sort of a particular immigration policy per se, but I think those are the kinds of complications that one could anticipate if Trump is elected.
What about on the bilateral relationship itself? I mean, has it got to a stage where it doesn't matter whether a Democrat is president or a Republican is president?
I think it matters. I think the issue is India is not an election issue.
Like Russia
is, Israel is, China is to some degree, Iran is, North Korea is even. But India's not, and that's good news. Nobody is campaigning on a tougher line on India, or both are trying to appeal to Indian American voters. I think the emphasis will be different, though. So for Trump, I anticipate that we'll have some challenges on immigration, as I mentioned, but also trade. And this is, again, not India specific. He wants to change trade policy very broadly, and this may include tariffs against India, which will lead to retaliatory tariffs by India against the US. I think with Harris also, I think there may be a shift, because there's no guarantee that her advisors will be the same as Biden's advisors.
Okay.
And I think we may see more of a sort of progressive agenda, again, globally, not directed against any particular country.
But in the context of India, what may that mean?
I think it'll be sort of more, people fear more preachiness on certain issues related to Indian domestic politics, which by and large, actually, the Biden administration has stayed away from. A less strategic approach to the Indo-Pacific, just in the list of priorities, that will not be so high. Will there be radical changes? I don't anticipate that, but I do think there'll be some changes around the margins. But it'll depend on personalities.
Just as we sort of wind down, is there any enthusiasm amongst the Indian American community that Harris is of Indian heritage, Indian ancestry, and therefore this is, historic, for want of a better word?
You think it would be a bigger issue than it has been. Surprisingly, it hasn't come up, and one can wonder why. I think primarily she has campaigned as an African-American political figure. And in some ways it makes sense. They're a much larger percentage of the population. That has been her base where she's risen up politically. She hasn't shied away from talking about particularly her mother and grandfather, her Indian heritage, the cultural attributes, but nor has she been very enthusiastic in claiming that mantle. So as a result, again, this is more anecdotal, we haven't really seen this, there hasn't been the level of enthusiasm we've seen amongst Indian Americans about this being a potentially historic first Indian American or Indian origin president of the US.
All right, and finally, so I know it's close, everyone's saying, it's going to go down to the wire, it'll boil down to a handful of states, but what does your gut say?
I'm not in the business of making predictions.
No,
but I know it's mostly to look at the different possibilities. I think one thing to expect is unpredictability. I think every one of the last few elections has surprised in some way. Both Indian elections, as somebody who follows Indian politics, but also U.S. elections. So I think expect some uncertainty, expect some surprises, even if around the margins. But let's see what happens.
And we can get a result on Tuesday night?
No, we won't. That is something I think that's pretty predictable. We won't get a result, I think, on election night itself, partly by how they count votes. So, a state like Nevada takes sometimes maybe days to count the votes. And if it's a close election, that will matter. Even Pennsylvania will take some time. So I don't think it may take a day or two at the very least to get
Before
a
we
full
get a
result.
full result. All right, Dhruva Jaishankar, as always, a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us here on CNN News 18. With camera person Chintan Dev Puri at the Farragut Square here in Washington, D.C., this is Zakka Jacob for CNN News 18.